5,000 years ago, in the floodplains of southern Iraq, a people carved the first written words humanity ever produced. We call them the Sumerians. According to the textbooks, they were farmers and priests who drifted down two slow rivers in little boats made of bundled reeds, a modest people, a river culture. The quiet, primitive starting point of the entire human story. But hidden inside their own clay tablets are descriptions of vessels so enormous, so far beyond anything a river should ever be able to carry, that historians have spent the last 100 years quietly explaining them away. Ships measured not in feet, but in the length of a city wall. So, what really happened to the Sumerian Navy that nobody wants to talk about? And before we go any deeper, if buried history is the reason you clicked on this video, do one thing for me right now. Hit that subscribe button. This channel exists for one reason, to drag the forgotten chapters of the human story back into the light. The chapters that got smoothed over, renamed, and quietly filed under mythology. Stay with me all the way to the end, because what you are about to hear does not just add a footnote to the story of the cradle of civilization. It pulls the whole foundation out from under it. Start with the version of history you were handed in a classroom. Around 4,000 years before Christ, a scattering of city-states rose up in the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur. These were the people who gave us writing, the wheel, the plow, mathematics, and the first true cities on Earth. Brilliant, yes, but limited. According to the accepted timeline, their watercraft never amounted to much. Reed bundles lashed together and waterproofed with black bitumen tar. Good enough to move grain, fish, and clay pots a few miles down a calm river. A humble little fleet for a humble little people. That is the story. And it collapses the moment you read what the Sumerians actually wrote about themselves. Go to the ancient city of Lagash. A ruler there named Gudea left behind long inscriptions carved into stone and clay. In those inscriptions, he describes the cargo flowing into his city's harbor, not from the next village, not from upstream, but from distant lands the Sumerians called Magan, Meluha, and Dilmun. Lands we now believe stretched as far as Oman, the coast of Iran, and the Indus Valley of Pakistan. Into Gudea's harbor came copper by the ton, diorite stone heavy enough to break a man, cedar timber, gold, carnelian, goods that had to cross hundreds of miles of open salt water to arrive. You do not move that across the Persian Gulf on a bundle of reeds. The Sumerians had a specific word for these ocean-going vessels, the magar. And the magar was not a fishing canoe. In their own records, the largest of these ships carried capacities that translate to dozens of tons of cargo. They were given names the same way a modern nation names a battleship or an aircraft carrier. They were dedicated to gods, registered, taxed, assigned crews, and tracked through the temple accounting system. One ancient text refers to a vessel as the boat that touches the heavens. And the trade itself was not a trickle. The records of describe entire merchant families whose only business was the sea, organizing voyage after voyage out to Dilmun and back. Dilmun, the island we now know as Bahrain, was not a quiet fishing village either. It was a roaring trade hub, a clearinghouse where the goods of 3 continents changed hands. A trade network running at that scale does not float on canoes. It runs on a working merchant fleet with shipwrights, harbor masters, and dry docks built to keep those vessels seaworthy year after year. Stop and think about that. Why would a civilization of simple reed rafts bother to name its boats, dedicate them to deities, and track them like national treasures? You do not name a rowboat. You name something when it is the single most powerful and valuable object your society has ever built. The Sumerians treated their ships the way an empire treats its navy, because that is almost certainly what it was. Then there is the problem of scale. And this is where the official story truly begins to crack. The Sumerians measured everything. They were obsessive record keepers. Every sack of barley, every plot of land, every loan, and every contract was written down in a unit called the cubit. So when their scribes recorded the dimensions of the great temple barges and the deepwater cargo ships, they were not guessing. They were doing the one thing they did better than anyone else alive at the time, counting. And when you take those stated measurements and convert them into numbers you can picture, the numbers refuse to behave. Some of the vessels described in Sumerian texts would, on paper, have stretched well over 100 feet from bow to stern. Certain temple processional ships, by their own recorded dimensions, would have run longer than the base of a ziggurat. Hulls that would stand shoulder to shoulder with the wooden sailing ships of the European age of exploration, built supposedly 3,500 years before a single one of those European ships ever touched the water. Mainstream historians do have an answer ready for this. They say the Sumerians exaggerated. They say the scribes were being poetic, inflating their figures to flatter a king or glorify a temple. And perhaps in some cases, that is true. But watch carefully what just happened inside that explanation. The very same scribes we trust completely to record the first written laws in human history, the first business contracts, the first medical texts, the first detailed astronomical observations ever made, those same meticulous scribes suddenly transform into unreliable liars the instant they describe the size of a ship. You cannot have it both ways. Either the Sumerian record is accurate, or it is not. Choosing to believe it only when it fits the staircase of progress is not history. It is editing. Now walk out of the library and into the ruins themselves, because the ground tells the very same story. The Sumerian city of Ur was, at its height, a port. The texts are not subtle about this. They speak of Ur's docks, its quays, its shipyards, its harbor district. Ships sailed in and out of Ur carrying the wealth of the entire ancient world. There is only one problem with that. Stand in the ruins of Ur today, and the nearest shoreline of the Persian Gulf is roughly 150 miles away. Bone-dry desert in every direction. And Ur is not alone. Eridu, said to be the first city ever built, Lagash, Gursu, one after another, cities the records insist were thriving harbor towns now sit stranded deep inland, far from any sea at all. The textbook explanation for this is silt. Over thousands of years, the Tigris and the Euphrates carried down so much mud and sediment that they slowly pushed the coastline back and left these ports high and dry. And honestly, that is a reasonable theory. The rivers do carry enormous loads of silt. But follow that logic all the way to where it actually leads. If the geography of an entire region could be transformed that completely, if an entire arm of the ocean could be pushed back 150 miles and buried, then ask the question the textbook never says out loud. How much of the Sumerian world is now sealed under that same mud? How many harbors, how many shipyards, how many of those enormous named vessels are lying right now under 10, 20, 30 feet of hardened sediment in places no archaeologist will ever bring a shovel? We are not looking at the complete Sumerian civilization. We are looking at the small, dry, surviving fraction of it that the mud happened to spare. And the mud itself has a story to tell. In the 1920s, the archaeologist Leonard Woolley was digging at Ur. Deep below the city, beneath the layers of houses and temples and royal graves, his team cut through something that stopped them cold. A thick, clean band of water-laid silt, several feet of it, sterile mud with no artifacts, no bones, no broken pottery, separating one layer of human civilization from an older, different layer buried underneath. Woolley stood in that trench, looked down at that sterile band of flood silt, and said it plainly. He believed he had found the physical fingerprint of the Great Flood. A real, catastrophic deluge, deep enough and violent enough to bury a city whole and leave a scar in the earth you could still reach out and touch 4,000 years later. Because every culture that grew out of Mesopotamia carried the exact same memory. A flood. Not a swollen field after a hard rain. A world-ending catastrophe. The Epic of Gilgamesh, first written down by the Sumerians and their successors, describes a man warned by a god to abandon his possessions and build a vessel. A ship large enough to carry the seed of all living things through a deluge sent to wipe humanity off the face of the earth. And the dimensions handed down for that vessel are staggering, a massive structure of multiple decks divided into dozens of internal compartments, sealed watertight with bitumen, the same black tar the Sumerians used on every boat they ever built. We have been carefully trained to file that account under religion. Under myth. Under the things primitive people supposedly invented to explain a frightening world. But the Sumerians themselves did not treat it as a story. They treated it as history. They placed the flood directly on their official timeline. The Sumerian King List, one of the most important documents they ever produced, names the kings who reigned before the flood. And then states, in plain words, then the flood sweeps over. And then it lists the kings who reigned after. The flood is not a fable to them. It is a date, a hard line drawn straight across their own recorded past. And that single detail changes everything. Because if a society capable of designing and building a survival vessel of that scale already existed before the disaster, then the humble reed boats we are taught about are not the beginning of Sumerian shipbuilding. They are the wreckage. They are what was left in the hands of the survivors after something far greater was destroyed and drowned. The version of Sumer that fills our textbooks, the version with the modest little fleet, is not the dawn of civilization at all. It is the morning after a collapse. We have been studying the rebuild and calling it the beginning. A civilization clawing its way back after a catastrophe does not restart with ocean-going giants. It restarts with rafts. The reed boats are not evidence that the Sumerians were primitive. They may be the clearest evidence we have that something enormous was lost, and that the people who survived spent generations slowly, painfully trying to remember how to build it again. So, why does the official story refuse to even consider this possibility? Part of the answer is honest academic caution. Historians deal in physical evidence, and a wooden ship's hull simply does not survive 5,000 years buried in a wet riverbed. It rots. It vanishes. With no hole to put under a microscope, the safe move is always to assume the smallest possible version of events. But there is another part of the answer, and it is far less innocent. The accepted story of human progress is a clean, comfortable staircase: Stone Age, then Bronze Age, then Iron Age. Each step sitting neatly above the one before it. Simple to teach, simple to defend. A Sumerian navy with ships the size of cathedrals does not sit anywhere on that staircase. It is a wrecking ball swung straight at it. And the institutions that built the staircase, the universities, the museums, the careers and reputations all stacked on top of it, have no incentive whatsoever to hand you the wrecking ball. And here is the thought that should genuinely keep you awake tonight. Sumer is not an isolated case. Look across the entire ancient world, and you find the same fingerprints again and again. Harbors stranded miles inland, stonework cut with a precision the tools we assign to the builders could never have achieved, records of fleets of machines, of structures that the official history quietly waves away as exaggeration, every single time. The same pattern repeating on continent after continent: a great and capable civilization, a sudden violent break, a layer of mud, and a rebuilt people who remember their own ancestors not as humans but as gods who walked the earth before the flood. Either every culture on the planet independently invented the identical legend, a lost golden age swallowed by water, purely by coincidence, or those legends were never legends at all. They are eyewitness testimony. The Sumerian Navy is not a strange little anomaly to be explained away. It is one visible piece of a far larger picture that has been broken apart and scattered so that no one ever assembles it. A picture of a world that was once more connected, more skilled, and more advanced than the staircase will ever permit us to say out loud. We may never see one of those great megaships lifted out of the silt. The mud of Mesopotamia guards what it holds, and the institutions with the money to fund the digging have very little interest in unearthing the one thing that would rewrite their own textbooks. But the clay tablets are still here. The measurements are still here. The named ships, the foreign harbors 150 miles from the nearest water, the flood that the Sumerians recorded as plain and simple fact, all of it still exists. It is sitting in museum drawers and storage basements right now, waiting for someone willing to read it without flinching. The Sumerians told us in their own careful handwriting exactly what they built. We were simply taught not to believe them. So the question is no longer whether the great ships were real. The question is, what else is buried in that mud? What else have we been quietly instructed to forget? If this video cracked something open in your mind, do not let it close again. The next forgotten chapter is already waiting for you on screen, and it cuts even deeper than this one did. Watch it now. And whatever you do, keep asking the question they are hoping you never ask out loud: what did we lose, and who decided that we should never be allowed to remember it?